My name is Claire. I am 29 years old, and for most of my life I believed that if I worked hard enough and gave enough, my family would finally see my worth. I paid their bills, I showed up at every holiday, and I tried to prove I was more than the quiet girl my father always dismissed. But Christmas has a way of exposing truths you cannot hide. That night, with the tree glowing and the table full, my father raised his glass and said words that cut me deeper than ever before. What would you do if the people who should love you most looked you in the eye and called you a burden? Stay with me because what happened next changed everything. Let me take you back to where it began. At Christmas dinner, the table was glowing with candles, and the tree lights twinkled across the room. Plates of food were set out neatly, the ham glistening, the rolls steaming, the wine glasses filled. My family filled the chairs, laughter and clinking silverware filling the air, but inside my chest there was only a steady ache. I kept reminding myself this was supposed to be my night, my way of showing them I was no longer the child they dismissed, but a woman with a career, a home, a life. Then my father lifted his glass, his hand steady, though I knew he had been drinking. He looked across the table at me, his eyes narrowing. Everyone else kept smiling, forks still raised, waiting for his toast. And then he said it. "You will always be a burden." The words fell heavy in the air, as if the room itself had gasped. My fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate with a sharp clang. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall and nothing else. My cousin stared down at her napkin. My uncle pulled out his phone as if something urgent had appeared on the screen, and my aunt smoothed the fabric of her dress with nervous hands. No one said a word. I sat frozen, feeling the heat rise up my neck, my face burning, my chest tightening. This was not the first time my father had cut me down, but something about the timing, about the way every eye at that table pretended not to see me break, made the words echo louder than ever before. I thought about every year that had led to this moment, every sacrifice, every step I had taken to prove that I was worth something. I wanted to shout, to slam my hands on the table, but instead I pressed my palms into my lap nails, digging into my skin, keeping myself composed. I heard Ethan's hand shift under the table until his fingers brushed mine, a small squeeze, silent and steady. His calm eyes met mine, and I knew he had felt it too, the cruelty in that single sentence. The room had gone quiet. My brother cleared his throat as if to say something, but then he leaned back and reached for his wine instead. My cousin's kids giggled softly in the corner of the living room, too young to notice the crack that had just split the family gathering in two. I stared at the tree, at the ornaments my mother once hung, years ago before she was gone. For a second I felt her presence warm and steady, telling me to hold on, to stay strong, and I thought if she were here, would she have stopped him? Would she have told him to sit down and be quiet, that I was not a burden, but the very opposite, the one who kept giving? But she was not here. It was just me, a woman almost 30, sitting in her own apartment, surrounded by family who refused to see her worth. And my father still sipping from his glass, as if what he had said was nothing at all, as if he had only spoken the plain truth. I kept my face calm, but inside something shifted. It was the same old wound, but this time it cut deeper, sharp enough to change everything. The weight of his words pressed down on me, and I realized I could not carry it silently anymore. I took a slow breath, let it fill my lungs, let my heart steady. I looked around that table and knew this night would not end the way my father expected. I thought about every holiday before this one. The Thanksgivings where I brought side dishes only to hear how Jessica's food was better. The birthdays when my father slipped Thomas an envelope of cash while telling me I should learn to be less selfish. The nights I came home from college and laid my suitcase down in the hallway, only to be told I was making the house feel cramped. Those memories piled up in my chest until I thought I might choke on them. The taste of the wine in my glass had turned bitter. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier had vanished. All I could hear was the faint sound of a car passing outside and the crackle of the fireplace. The silence was so complete it pressed against my ears. Ethan shifted in his chair, leaning slightly closer. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, grounding me. He whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Breathe." I glanced at him and then at the others. My uncle's expensive watch gleamed as he pretended to scroll his phone. My aunt's lips were pressed into a thin smile. Jessica twisted the ring on her finger, refusing to look up. Daniel leaned back, his cheeks flushed from drinking, a smirk tugging at his lips, as if he found the tension amusing. My father still stared at me, his glass halfway to his lips, waiting. He wanted me to shrink, to nod, and swallow it down the way I always had. He wanted me to carry his words home like another weight added to my shoulders. But something inside me resisted. The girl who used to cry quietly in her bedroom was gone. The young woman who kept paying bills in silence was fading too. In that moment, I felt a flicker of strength I had not felt in years, like my mother's hand on my back telling me to rise. I straightened in my chair and lifted my chin. My lips pressed together, but no words came yet. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than the ticking clock, louder than the fire popping in the grate. I knew I would speak, maybe not tonight. Maybe not this very second, but I knew I would not leave this table the same way I had come. The air in the room had shifted. Even the children had gone quiet, sensing the tension. My father set his glass down with a small thud, satisfied he had silenced me once again. He leaned back, reaching for another slice of ham, and the moment seemed to pass for everyone else. But for me, it had only just begun. I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my pulse racing, and thought, this is the last time he will ever call me a burden without hearing the truth. When I was 16, I stood in the hallway of our old house in Oak Brook and watched my mother's casket carried out the front door. Snow was falling that morning, tiny flakes clinging to the black coats of the men who came to take her away. The world felt too quiet, as if even the wind had stopped to watch. I remember clutching the sleeve of my younger brother Thomas, who was barely 14, and feeling him tremble beside me. That was the moment everything in our family shifted. My mother, Laura, had been the soft center of our lives. She was a fourth-grade teacher, gentle but firm, with a laugh that could fill every corner of our house. She always knew how to smooth the sharp edges of my father's temper. She had been the one who encouraged me to draw, who bought me sketch pads even when money was tight. Losing her meant losing that shield. After she was gone, my father changed. He worked long shifts as a warehouse supervisor, came home smelling of sweat and beer, and sat in his chair staring at the television. He started drinking more first, just a can or two, then hard liquor. His words grew sharper, his patience shorter. At first I thought it was grief, and maybe it was, but grief hardened into something darker. It turned into bitterness. I began to notice how differently he treated Thomas and me. When Thomas failed a class, my father shrugged and said boys needed time to mature. When I got an A, he would grumble about how grades did not put food on the table. Thomas could come home late, skip chores, and still get a pat on the shoulder. If I was 5 minutes late from the library, I would find him waiting at the door demanding an explanation. There was one night not long after my mother's funeral when I overheard him on the phone with my Uncle Robert. He was talking about how hard it was to raise 2 kids on one income. His voice dropped lower, but I still heard him say that I was expensive, that everything about me cost money he did not have. The words burned into me. From then on, I carried the sense that I was not just a daughter, but a bill he had to pay. The house itself felt emptier, too. My mother's pictures stayed on the walls, but her warmth was gone. At Christmas, the year after her death, the decorations were half-hearted. The stockings she had sewn by hand were left in a box. My father bought a small artificial tree and told us it was easier that way. I tried to make it feel normal, hanging a few ornaments myself, but it felt like pretending. School became my refuge. I poured myself into drawing, into every art class I could take. Teachers noticed and encouraged me, telling me I had talent. That encouragement became my lifeline. I sketched late into the night at the desk my mother had bought from a garage sale, the lamp casting a yellow circle over my paper, while the rest of the house sat in shadow. Thomas drifted the other way. He started skipping classes, hanging out with kids who smoked behind the gym, coming home, smelling like cheap cologne and cigarettes. My father brushed it off, saying boys would be boys. When Thomas totaled his bike because he was drunk, Dad gave him another with barely a lecture. Meanwhile, if I so much as misplaced a notebook, I heard about it for days. The imbalance only grew sharper as we got older. I worked part-time at a diner when I was 17, saving every dollar for college. My father never once asked me how my shifts went. But when Thomas got a summer job washing cars, Dad celebrated with beers, bragging that his boy was learning responsibility. I sat on the porch that night listening to their laughter through the screen door and felt like an outsider in my own family. One evening, I remember clearly. I had stayed late at the library preparing for a school art show. When I came home, Dad was waiting in the living room with the lights off. He demanded to know why I was late. I explained I had been painting, but he shook his head and told me I was selfish, always wasting time on things that would never pay the bills. Then he muttered that I was just another weight on his shoulders. The phrase pierced me, and hearing it again years later at Christmas dinner was like reliving that night. I tried to hold on to my mother's memory through small rituals. I kept one of her scarves, light blue, with tiny silver threads folded in my drawer. Sometimes I would wrap it around my neck and sit at my desk pretending she was there. I still remember her voice telling me I could be whatever I wanted, that I was not a burden, but a blessing. Those words carried me through the darkest years, even as my father's bitterness grew louder. By the time I was finishing high school, the distance between us was impossible to ignore. He attended Thomas's football games even when Thomas sat on the bench cheering him on. But when I won an award for a regional art contest, he barely looked up from his beer. He told me to stop drawing on napkins and find something useful to do. That night I cried in the bathroom with the door locked, biting my sleeve so no one would hear. I learned early to swallow my feelings, to stay quiet, to avoid his temper. But inside I promised myself that one day I would prove him wrong. I would take the education he said was worthless and build something of my own. I would show him that the girl he saw as a burden could carry herself and more. Those years hardened me, but they also shaped me. I learned to rely on myself, to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Every paycheck from my diner job went into a jar I kept hidden under my bed. Every compliment from a teacher I stored like a treasure. I told myself that once I left for college, everything would change. The night before I moved into the dorms at the University of Illinois at Chicago, I packed my suitcase and looked around my small bedroom one last time. My father did not help me load the car. He sat in his chair, staring at the television, a beer in hand. When I told him I was leaving in the morning, he just said, "Try not to waste the money." I carried my bag outside alone, the summer air heavy, my brother nowhere to be found. As I lay in bed that night, the window cracked open to let in the warm air. I thought about my mother. I imagined her tucking me and whispering the words she used to say, that I was enough, that I was capable. I clung to that as tightly as I clung to the pillow. The next morning, I drove away, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror. My stomach knotted with fear, but also with determination. Whatever waited for me in Chicago, it had to be better than the silence and the bitterness I was leaving behind. I did not know then how hard it would be, or how many years of struggle were ahead, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would not let my father's words define me forever. The city felt enormous the day I moved into my dorm at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Cars honked in steady streams, the buildings rose higher than anything back in Oak Brook, and the sidewalks pulsed with students carrying boxes and suitcases. I clutched my sketch portfolio under my arm, trying to breathe in the mix of fear and excitement that swirled inside me. The dorm room was small, 2 twin beds pressed against opposite walls, a narrow desk, and a window that overlooked the parking lot. My roommate, a girl from Milwaukee named Hannah, greeted me with a bright smile and posters of bands I had never heard of. She hung them immediately, humming to herself while I unpacked my supplies. I laid out pencils and brushes as carefully as someone might arrange jewelry. To me, they were treasures. The first weeks were a blur of lectures, crowded hallways, and long nights spent sketching in the art studio. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who cared about the same things I did. We debated about colors and lines, about form and composition, while our hands were stained with charcoal dust. Professors encouraged me, telling me my eye for detail was sharp, that my discipline showed. Their words lit fires in me, small but steady. Money was always tight. I worked evenings at a small diner near campus, wiping down tables until my fingers ached pouring coffee for weary travelers on the interstate. The uniform smelled like grease, and my feet blistered from standing 10 hours straight. But every dollar I earned went toward books, art supplies, and sometimes a bus ticket back home when I felt too guilty for not visiting. Those trips home were never easy. My father never came to pick me up from the station. I would drag my suitcase across the cracked sidewalk and open the front door to the smell of stale beer. Thomas sprawled on the couch with a video game controller in his hand, barely glancing up. My father's first question was never about school or my grades, but how much I was spending. He would shake his head and mutter that I was lucky tuition was covered, as if scholarships fell from the sky instead of being earned. I learned to keep my achievements to myself. When I won a small citywide art competition, I told my father over dinner. He forked a piece of meatloaf and said it was fine, but then added that drawings would not pay the mortgage. My heart sank, but I smiled anyway, swallowing the hurt like medicine. Back at school, things were different. I found encouragement everywhere. Hannah dragged me to art shows in downtown galleries, where I saw what life could look like if I kept pushing. Professors urged me to submit my work to exhibitions, and when I did, I received quiet recognition. Nothing grand, but enough to keep me going. There were late nights that bled into morning me, crouched over my sketchpad in the studio, while the city lights glittered outside. My hand cramped from drawing, my eyes blurred from exhaustion, but I felt alive. The silence of those hours wrapped around me like safety. No one was criticizing me. No one was measuring me against Thomas or anyone else. It was just me and the paper and the belief that I could make something worthwhile. During sophomore year, I took a design internship downtown. It did not pay, but it gave me a glimpse of professional life. I spent hours adjusting layouts, watching senior designers debate over fonts and logos. I soaked in every detail, hungry to learn. Each evening I walked back to the dorm with my legs aching but my mind buzzing. The distance between me and my father grew wider. Calls were short, often tense. He asked if I had found a real job yet. He asked if I was dating anyone who could support me when my dreams collapsed. I learned to answer briefly and hang up quickly. One winter break I came home with high hopes. I had made the dean's list and brought the letter thinking it would finally make him proud. At dinner I slid the paper across the table. He barely glanced at it before saying grades were just ink on a page. He turned to Thomas and asked about his plans, as if my letter was nothing more than a napkin. That night I cried into my pillow, the blue scarf of my mother wrapped around me, whispering her words to myself. Still, I kept going. I poured everything into my work, winning a scholarship for a summer program in New York. For 2 months I lived in a cramped apartment with 3 other students, eating instant noodles and studying under designers who challenged me to think bigger. Those months opened my world. I came back to Chicago filled with ideas and determination. Senior year came quickly. My portfolio was thick with projects, my resume dotted with internships. Professors told me I had a strong chance at landing a good job if I kept up the pace. The thought thrilled me and terrified me in equal measure. I was standing at the edge of the life I wanted, and I knew I had to jump. Graduation day arrived in the spring of 2019. The auditorium filled with families, cameras flashing, mothers holding bouquets, fathers clapping as their children walked across the stage. I scanned the crowd as my name was called, clutching my diploma with trembling hands. Faces blurred together, cheers echoing, but the seat where my father should have been was empty. I tried not to let it show. I smiled, shook hands, posed for the photo, but inside I was hollow. After the ceremony, I stood outside beneath a bright blue sky, students hugging their parents all around me. Hannah's parents wrapped their arms around her, tears streaming down their cheeks. I stood alone, the diploma heavy in my hand, wondering if it meant anything at all without someone there to witness it. Later that night, I sat in my tiny apartment, the cap and gown folded on the chair, and stared at the piece of paper that represented 4 years of work. The silence pressed in, reminding me again that my father did not believe in me, that no matter what I achieved, he would never see it. I felt both broken and determined. Broken because I wanted so badly for him to be proud. Determined because I knew his absence meant I had to be proud of myself. I tucked the diploma into its case and whispered to the empty room that this was only the beginning. The summer after graduation was long and uncertain. I applied to every design job I could find in Chicago, sending out resume after resume, tailoring cover letters until my eyes blurred. Most responses were silence, a few were polite rejections, and the rest were interviews that led nowhere. Rent loomed each month, and I picked up shifts at a clothing store on Michigan Avenue, folding jeans until midnight, my feet throbbing inside cheap flats. When customers barked at me for the wrong size, I swallowed my pride and smiled. At night, I dragged myself home to my studio apartment, pulling out my laptop to work on freelance projects for small businesses that barely paid enough to cover groceries. I kept telling myself that every project was a stepping stone, that someday someone would notice. Back in Oak Brook, my father had plenty to say about my situation. On the rare weekends I visited, he would lean back in his chair with a beer in hand and ask if my fancy degree was keeping the lights on. Thomas, who had already dropped out of a community college program, sat beside him and smirked. My father's defense was always the same, that boys just needed more time. My achievements, no matter how hard-earned, were dismissed as luck or temporary. One Saturday evening, I arrived home with a bag of groceries I had bought for the house. My father looked at the receipt, shook his head, and muttered that I spent too much on frivolous food. I had bought chicken, rice, vegetables, and a carton of milk. Nothing extravagant. The words stung because I was spending money I could barely spare. Still, I kept trying. I told myself that if I worked harder, saved longer, maybe one day he would look at me with pride. I held on to that thought the way a child holds on to fairy tales. There was one winter when the cold seeped into every corner of my apartment. The radiator barely worked and the windows rattled when the wind pushed against them. I pulled on 2 sweaters, heated a pot of soup, and opened my email to find another rejection. I laid my head on the desk and let the tears come quick and hot before wiping them away with the sleeve of my sweater. No one could see, but the weight of failure pressed heavy. Even then, I never stopped sending money home. From the moment I earned more than minimum wage, I sent my father $500 each month. I told myself it was my duty, that he had worked hard to raise us, that I owed him something. I skipped dinners out with friends and wore the same pair of shoes until the soles thinned just to keep up with those transfers. When Thomas's car was repossessed, my father called late at night. His voice was calm, almost expectant, as he said Thomas needed help. I transferred $6,000 from my savings, watching my balance shrink until I could hardly breathe. Thomas never thanked me. My father simply said I had done the right thing. There were smaller requests, too. My cousin Daniel called asking for money for a job training course he never finished. My uncle Robert mentioned short-term trouble with a development project, so I lent him $8,000 I had worked years to save. Every time I convinced myself it was temporary, that one day it would come back to me, not in dollars, but in respect. That day never came. At work in the clothing store, I often caught my reflection in the mirror while refolding a pile of sweaters. I hardly recognized myself, eyes tired, hair pulled back, uniform stiff with starch. But behind the fatigue there was a spark. I reminded myself that I was more than this, that my degree was not wasted, that opportunity was out there. During those lean years, I clung to any encouragement. A client from a freelance project once emailed me saying my design helped her bakery attract new customers. She wrote that my flyer made her proud of her shop again. I printed that email and taped it above my desk, reading it whenever doubt threatened to swallow me. The tension at home only grew. On Thanksgiving in 2020, I drove back with pies I had baked, hoping to contribute something special. At the table, my father made a remark about how Jessica, my cousin, had made her side dishes from scratch with her children, how wholesome and family-oriented she was. He looked at my pies and said they were fine but probably cost too much. My chest ached as everyone nodded politely, letting the comment pass. That night, I lay awake in my old room, staring at the ceiling, feeling both invisible and indispensable. They wanted my money, but never my presence, never my voice. I kept a journal during those years, scribbling late at night after long shifts. The pages are filled with questions I asked myself. Why am I never enough? Why do I keep giving? When will it change? Looking back now, those questions reveal a woman at the edge of breaking, trying to hold herself together with nothing but determination. By the summer of 2021, I was exhausted, but I also felt a stubborn fire inside me. Every insult, every rejection, every dismissal fueled it. I promised myself that no matter how many doors closed, I would keep knocking. One evening after a particularly hard shift, I sat at my desk and stared at my dwindling bank account. Rent was due, and my father had just hinted at another loan. My stomach twisted, but I sent the money anyway, telling myself it was for the last time. I folded my hands in my lap, the apartment quiet around me, and whispered into the stillness that somehow I would make this worth it. Somehow I would find a way out of the endless cycle of giving and never being seen. The break I had been waiting for finally came in the spring of 2022. I was scrolling job postings late one night when I saw an opening at a mid-sized advertising agency in downtown Chicago. My heart thumped as I clicked through the description. They wanted someone with a strong design portfolio experience with branding and the ability to work under pressure. It sounded impossible, but it also sounded like me. I stayed up until 3 a.m. polishing my resume and reworking my portfolio. By dawn, my eyes burned, but I hit submit. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing, and then an email landed in my inbox inviting me to an interview. I stared at the screen so long that the words blurred. The day of the interview, I wore my best black blazer, one I had found at a thrift store, but tailored myself. My hands shook as I clutched the portfolio case, riding the train into the loop. When I walked into the sleek lobby with its glass walls and modern furniture, I felt like an imposter. But as I sat across from the hiring manager and explained my projects, something inside me shifted. I spoke with a confidence I did not know I had. I told them about long nights balancing freelance work and retail jobs, about the bakery flyer that helped a struggling business grow. 2 days later, the call came. They wanted me to start in May. The first weeks were overwhelming. The office hummed with energy, people rushing with laptops tucked under their arms, conference rooms filled with animated voices. I was assigned to a team under a project manager named Michael Turner. He was sharp, often skeptical, but he gave clear direction. I stayed late most nights, perfecting designs, absorbing every critique, determined not to waste the chance I had been given. When the first campaign I worked on launched successfully, Michael gave me a nod across the room. It was not a big gesture, but it was enough to make my chest swell with pride. My life began to change quickly. By the fall, I was promoted to senior designer, a title I had dreamed of but never believed would come so soon. My salary finally covered rent bills, and something I had never known before, comfort. I moved out of my tiny studio into a modest one-bedroom apartment with sunlight streaming through big windows. For the first time, I could buy groceries without counting every cent. Around that time, I met Ethan. A mutual friend invited me to a small gathering at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, and he was there, tall, with kind eyes, sipping black coffee while flipping through a book. We struck up a conversation that lasted hours. He was a software engineer, steady and thoughtful, raised in a family that seemed foreign to me in its warmth. His parents lived in Evanston, still together after 30 years, proud of every step their son took. On our first official date, he asked me about my art, and I told him more than I had told anyone in years. He listened without judgment, his gaze steady, as if everything I said mattered. With him, I felt seen. Our relationship grew slowly but surely. He came to my office once with flowers after a long week, not caring that my coworkers teased me. He encouraged me to rest when I worked too late. When I confessed how my father often belittled me, Ethan shook his head and said it was not me who was lacking, it was my father. At work, I was thriving. Sarah Miller, a fellow designer a year younger than me, became my closest friend. We ate lunch together in the break room, swapped stories about difficult clients, and laughed about the quirks of office life. She told me I pushed her to be better, and I told her she kept me sane. Yet even as my world expanded, the shadow of my family lingered. My father called once to ask for help with bills. I transferred the money automatically, though my stomach clenched. Thomas texted me about a new phone he wanted, hinting that I could cover it. I ignored him, guilt gnawing at me anyway. Still, for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something real. My apartment had framed prints of my designs on the wall. The pantry was stocked, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who had clawed her way out of the emptiness. One evening, after a long day at the agency, Ethan and I sat on the couch in my new place, watching the city lights blink through the window. He reached for my hand and said softly that he saw how hard I worked, that I deserved more than survival. My throat tightened with emotion. For so long I had been waiting for someone to say those words. I leaned against him, thinking that maybe the cycle was finally shifting, that maybe I was no longer the girl who gave everything and received nothing. When I closed my eyes that night, the hum of the city in the background, I let myself believe that this was the start of a new chapter 1, where my worth would not be measured by anyone else's approval. The idea came to me on a cold November afternoon, as I stood in the middle of my apartment, staring at the boxes of ornaments I had brought up from storage. For years I had carried the weight of Christmas with a mix of dread and sadness, but this time I wanted something different. I wanted to reclaim the holiday, to create a gathering in my own space, one that reflected the woman I had become. I called Ethan that night, pacing near the window while the city buzzed below. I told him I wanted to host Christmas dinner at my apartment and invite the whole family. There was a pause on the line before he answered. His voice was gentle but steady. "Claire, I know you want to show them how far you have come, but are you sure they can see it?" I felt my throat tighten. Maybe they never would, but I needed to try. The following weeks were a blur of planning. I made lists that stretched across pages in my notebook. Ham glazed with honey-roasted vegetables, cranberry compote rolls rising in the oven. I reserved a few bottles of good wine, something my Uncle Robert would not be able to sneer at. I ordered new linens, polished the silverware, and found a set of crystal glasses at an antique store on Clark Street. Each detail felt like an offering, a statement that I was capable, successful, and no longer the struggling girl they had dismissed. Ethan watched me carefully as I moved around the apartment, stringing lights and rearranging furniture. Sometimes he reached for my hand and asked if I was doing this for myself or for them. I would smile and say both, but inside I knew I was still chasing something I might never catch. One evening I called my father to confirm. His voice crackled on the line, cool and skeptical. "Are you sure that place of yours is big enough? You know Jessica has more experience entertaining." I swallowed the sting and forced a cheerful tone. "It will be fine, Dad. I want to do this." He grunted, then muttered that I was probably showing off. I hung up the phone and pressed my forehead against the wall, willing myself not to cry. Sarah stopped by one Saturday afternoon, carrying a tray of cookies she had baked. She looked around at the garland I had hung along the window and the neatly set table. Her eyebrows lifted. "Claire, this looks like a magazine spread." I laughed, brushing flour from my jeans. "I just want it to be perfect." She tilted her head, her smile softening. "Perfect for who?" The question lingered long after she left. Work grew busy as December approached. We were closing out a campaign for a major client, and Michael pushed us harder than ever. Late nights at the office left me drained, but when I came home, the sight of the tree in the corner glowing softly revived me. Ethan started leaving small notes tucked between the ornaments, reminders that I was enough. One said simply, "They cannot take away what you built." I tucked it into my wallet like a charm. By mid-December, my apartment was ready. The spare chairs borrowed from neighbors, the extra leaves added to the dining table, the scent of cinnamon candles drifting through the rooms. I spent nearly $1,500 on groceries, wine, and decorations. Money, I told myself, was an investment in something bigger than a single night. A few days before Christmas, Ethan and I went shopping for last-minute items. As we walked through the crowded aisles of Mariano's, he paused near the produce section and touched my arm. "Claire, I just want to prepare you. They may not react the way you hope." My chest tightened as I placed apples into the cart. "I know, but I have to give myself this chance." The night before Christmas, I barely slept. I moved through the apartment, checking everything twice, ironing the napkins, polishing the serving dishes until they gleamed. Outside, the snow began to fall in slow, quiet flakes, blanketing the city in white. I stood at the window, watching it, feeling the mix of excitement and dread battle inside me. Christmas morning arrived with the smell of spices and roasted ham filling the air. Ethan arrived early, carrying flowers and a bottle of champagne. He kissed my forehead and said the place looked beautiful. I smiled, clutching his hand silently, thanking him for believing in me. By late afternoon, the first knock came. I opened the door to see Robert and Susan stepping inside their coats lined with snow. Robert glanced around, his eyes scanning the apartment like a man evaluating property. Susan smiled tightly and murmured how brave it was of me to choose such bold colors for the walls. I swallowed the sting and ushered them in. Not long after, Jessica arrived with her husband and children, their laughter filling the air. She hugged me, politely complimenting the flower arrangements. My father, however, leaned down to her ear, remarking how Jessica always made her own centerpieces, how much more personal that was. The words drifted through the room like smoke, settling heavy in my chest. Daniel stumbled in later, his cheeks flushed, smelling faintly of whiskey. He collapsed onto the couch without removing his shoes, stretching out as though it were his own. I asked softly if he could take them off, but before he moved, my father barked that I was being too precious about furniture. I forced a smile and turned back to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I adjusted the serving trays. The room filled quickly, voices rising, laughter overlapping. Yet beneath it all was a current of tension that I could feel pulsing against my skin. Every effort I had made, every dollar spent, seemed invisible. I watched as my father's eyes roamed the apartment, not with pride, but with suspicion, as if he were searching for flaws. Still, I kept moving, serving dishes, refilling glasses, keeping conversation flowing. Inside, though, a small voice whispered that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. As the evening settled, the table glittered with candles and food, the plates piled high. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, trying to steady my breath. This was the moment I had worked for, the moment I hoped would change the way my family saw me. But as I glanced at my father across the table, his eyes narrowed, his mouth set in a thin line, I realized the night was only just beginning, and the battle I had tried to outrun was waiting right there with me. The first half hour of dinner passed in a blur of chatter and clinking silverware. Jessica's children squirmed in their seats, giggling at inside jokes, while my Uncle Robert launched into a long story about a new development project in Naperville. My Aunt Susan nodded along, her polite smile fixed like it had been painted there. I forced myself to listen, nodding at the right moments, but inside my stomach tightened with each passing second. I had spent days preparing every dish, and now they sat steaming on the table, but no one commented on the flavors or the effort. Robert sliced into the ham, with a remark about how the cut was smaller than the one Jessica's husband had prepared last year. Susan leaned over her plate, whispering about how bold it was of me to attempt a complicated cranberry compote, as if I had taken on something too ambitious for my skill. When I tried to ask about Jessica's work at the elementary school, my father cut in before she could answer. "Teaching is noble," he said with a satisfied smile. "It actually matters." The implication hung in the air. My career-building campaigns and branding strategies did not. I felt Ethan's hand press against mine under the table. He squeezed gently, his silent way of telling me to breathe, to let it pass. But the weight of his comfort only reminded me how desperately I wanted my family to see what he saw in me. Daniel leaned back in his chair, wineglass in hand, and kicked his shoes against my table leg. He laughed loudly at one of Robert's jokes, spilling a drop of red wine onto the white tablecloth. I dabbed at it quickly, but before I could say anything, my father barked that stains were part of life and that I should not act like a museum curator. My face burned as everyone chuckled uncomfortably. Jessica reached across to compliment the flower arrangements, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. But my father leaned toward her and said loudly that Jessica always made her own centerpieces, how much more personal and meaningful that was. The words landed like stones in my chest. I watched Jessica's face pink with embarrassment, but she said nothing. The room grew warmer, voices overlapping, the sound of forks scraping against plates. Yet beneath the surface, I felt the current of judgment, the constant comparisons, the measuring tape held against me. I glanced at Ethan, who looked around the table with disbelief, his lips pressed tight. Robert started asking about careers, and the spotlight shifted quickly. He bragged about his firm, about closing million-dollar deals, then turned to Jessica to praise her for shaping young minds. He paused, letting the silence fall as eyes turned toward me. I lifted my glass of water, steadying my hand, and shared that I had been promoted to senior designer that fall. I explained that I now led a small team managing major accounts. For a moment, I felt proud, believing it might be enough to pierce the wall of indifference. My father set down his fork with a clatter. "Easy to get promoted when you have no real responsibilities," he said flatly. "Wait until you have a mortgage and kids. Let's see how far that career takes you then." The words sucked the air out of me. Across the table, Susan chimed in, her voice sweet as sugar but sharp beneath. In our day, work was about service, not chasing personal fulfillment or big paychecks. We knew better than to expect too much. I forced myself to chew to swallow to keep my voice even. But inside, the walls I had built to protect myself began to crack. The children asked to be excused, and Jessica led them to the living room where the tree glowed with colored lights. Their laughter drifted back into the dining room, a bright contrast to the heaviness settling among the adults. Ethan leaned closer, whispering, "You don't have to take this." His words struck something deep inside me. But before I could gather myself, my father lifted his glass again. His eyes landed on me with the same cold weight I had known all my life. As the conversation resumed around him, I felt it building, the sense that he was waiting for the perfect moment, that he was winding up for the blow he had delivered so many times before. The ham sat half-eaten, the wine glasses nearly empty, and my pulse beat harder with each second. I looked around at the faces of the people I had spent my life trying to please, each one avoiding my gaze, each one complicit in the silence. I knew then that the words I dreaded most were coming, and I knew with a clarity I had never felt before that when they did, I would not stay silent. My father raised his glass, his eyes narrowing until the corners of his mouth curved into something between a sneer and a smile. The room fell into an expectant hush, as if everyone knew what was coming. He leaned slightly forward, the dim light catching the lines in his face, and spoke with deliberate weight. "You will always be a burden." The words did not just drop into the air, they thundered through me. My fork slipped from my hand and struck the plate with a sharp metallic ring. Around the table, movements froze. Robert glanced down at his phone as if suddenly fascinated by nothing. Susan pressed her napkin against her lips, pretending to fuss. Jessica lowered her eyes to her plate, cheeks flushed. Daniel shifted in his chair, smirking until he realized no one else would laugh. The silence stretched so long I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ethan's grip tightened around my hand beneath the table, steady and grounding. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. I had heard those words before, muttered in different forms, but never spoken so openly, so confidently in front of everyone. I looked at my father and for the first time did not see a figure of authority. I saw a man who had chosen cruelty over kindness, who believed breaking me would make him stronger. The sting of his words still cut, but layered beneath was something new, something fiercer. I straightened slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood. Every eye at the table turned toward me, though most refused to hold my gaze. I lifted my glass, not in toast, but to steady my trembling hands, then set it down carefully. "Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I am not a burden." The words hovered in the air, fragile yet sharp. Robert cleared his throat but said nothing. Susan shifted uncomfortably. Jessica whispered something to her husband, who patted her hand without looking at me. Daniel swirled the wine in his glass, as though waiting for entertainment. My father leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his eyes locked on mine, daring me to continue. For years, I worked 2 jobs while finishing school. I sent money home even when I could barely afford groceries. I kept this family afloat more times than anyone here cares to admit. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, fueled by the years of silence that had smothered me. A ripple of discomfort moved through the table. Robert lowered his phone, his expression guarded. Susan stared at the flickering candle as if it held answers. Jessica shifted in her seat, her shoulders tense. I remembered every night I had cried into my pillow, every dollar I had sent, every time I had been overlooked or dismissed. And now, with the room silent and every face turned away, I felt those memories rise like a tide inside me. Ethan leaned closer, whispering softly, "You don't have to hold back." His words steadied me further. My father's lips curved into a cold smile. "You want recognition, Claire, is that it? You want applause for doing what any decent child should?" Something in me snapped. My hands pressed against the table, my nails biting into the linen. "No," I said firmly. "I want the truth acknowledged. I want this family to admit that I am not the problem." The air grew heavier, so dense it felt like breathing underwater. Jessica's children, sensing the tension from the living room, had gone quiet. Their absence made the silence at the table more complete. Robert finally spoke, his voice low. "Maybe this is not the time." His eyes flickered between me and my father, wary of the storm brewing. "It is exactly the time," I answered, surprising even myself. "I have sat through years of dinners listening to how Jessica is perfect, how Thomas just needs time, how Daniel will figure it out. And through it all, I am told that I am too much, too expensive, too demanding." My father's eyes narrowed further. His jaw clenched, but he stayed silent, letting me twist in the space he thought would choke me. Instead, the quiet fueled me. I glanced around the table. "None of you spoke up tonight," I said, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Not when he humiliated me in my own home. Not when he told me I was nothing but a burden. The truth is, you all let him do it because it keeps the rest of you safe." The words sliced through the silence. Susan's eyes darted away. Robert shifted in his seat. Jessica's hands clenched in her lap, her face pale. Daniel leaned back farther, his smirk fading as the room weighed heavy. My father lifted his glass again, as if to punctuate his authority, but his hand was less steady than before. I met his gaze without flinching. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the man who had spent so long pressing me down. No one dared to breathe. My father set his glass down hard enough that the stem rattled against the wood, but he still did not speak. The silence stretched until my own heartbeat filled my ears. My palms were damp against the tablecloth, yet I refused to look away. I had hidden too long behind lowered eyes and bitten lips. Tonight the words had already been spoken, and there was no taking them back. I pushed back my chair and stood. The legs scraped against the floor, a sharp sound that cut through the heavy quiet. My father's gaze followed me, dark and expectant, as though daring me to falter. I rested my hands on the edge of the table and steadied my breath. "You say I am a burden," I began, my voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each syllable. "But what you never say is how much I have carried." Robert shifted uneasily, his fork clinking against his plate. Susan glanced down, fussing with her napkin as if the crease mattered more than my words. Jessica's eyes flicked up briefly, then dropped to her lap. Daniel swirled the last of his wine and smirked like he was watching a show unfold. I turned my gaze back to my father. "Do you remember when you could not pay the mortgage 2 years ago when the bank was sending letters? I paid $12,000 to keep this house from being taken. 12,000. The number hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Robert's head snapped up, his expression faltering. Susan froze with the napkin half folded in her lap. I looked at Thomas's empty chair, though he was not there. "And when your son could not keep up with his car payments, I covered $6,000, so he would not lose his only transportation. Twice." Daniel shifted uncomfortably now, his smirk slipping. "And you, Daniel?" I added, turning toward him. "You begged me for money to cover that training program you swore would change your life. $800 gone, and you never finished the course." His face reddened, and he muttered something under his breath, but no one asked him to repeat it. I let the silence deepen before continuing. "Uncle Robert, remember that short-term loan you needed for your project in Aurora? $15,000 wired from my account with your promise to repay quickly. It took you 1.5 years, and not once did you mention it in front of anyone." Robert opened his mouth, then shut it, his face pale. I leaned closer, my voice firm now, almost shaking with the release of years of silence. "Every one of you has leaned on me when it suited you. And still I am the one called a burden." No one moved. The candles flickered as if the air itself had grown thinner. Ethan sat tall beside me, his hand resting near mine, but not interfering, letting me own this moment. I straightened my chest, heaving, and turned back to my father. I have been the one holding this family together while you all looked away, and I am done letting you pretend otherwise. My father's face was tight, the muscles in his jaw working. He gripped the edge of his chair as if holding himself in place. For a long moment he said nothing, the weight of my words pressing into the room like another presence. Susan finally spoke, her voice thin. "Claire, maybe we should not air these things at the table." I turned to her, my anger sharpened by years of her polite cruelty. "Why not? Why should I stay quiet when I have been humiliated in my own home? When the man who raised me tells me I am worthless while sitting at the table I paid to set." Her lips closed and she looked away, cheeks flushed. The children in the other room had gone still, their laughter replaced by hushed whispers. The entire apartment seemed to be holding its breath. I felt my hands steady for the first time all night. The fear that had always silenced me was gone. In its place was clarity, a resolve that left no room for shame. My father's voice finally broke through. "You think money makes you better than this family." His words were low, meant to sting. I met his eyes unflinching. "Number, but it proves I am not the burden you say I am." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling out across every face. For the first time in years, no one had an answer. I pulled my chair back in, sitting tall, the plate before me untouched. My hands folded in my lap, calm, now steady. Around me the room buzzed with the sound of silence, thick and unrelenting. The truth was out, and nothing could press it back down again. My father's chair creaked as he leaned back, his face flushed red, his jaw clenching as if he was holding back a storm. His hand gripped the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The others stayed frozen, eyes darting between us, waiting to see who would break first. Robert cleared his throat, trying to smooth the tension. "Let's not ruin Christmas," he said, his voice thin, but it only made the silence heavier. I felt the tremor in my chest ease into something steadier. My heart still pounded, but it no longer felt like fear. I looked at each of them one by one, letting the weight of what I had revealed linger. "Do you know what it feels like," I asked softly, "to sit at this table year after year and hear nothing but how much of a disappointment I am? To give everything I have and still be told I am nothing?" Jessica's eyes flickered up at me, wide and uncertain. Her children had gone quiet in the living room, their whispers muffled. Susan pressed her lips together, her hands folded tight in her lap. I straightened my back and kept my voice firm. "I am done letting you talk about me like I am less than. I built my life without any of you. I earned every dollar, every promotion, every inch of peace I have." My father's voice cut through, sharp and bitter. "And what do you want now? Applause? You think standing here with your fancy job makes you better than us?" I leaned forward, my hands steady on the table. "No, Dad. I want respect. I want the truth acknowledged. That I have carried more than my share, while you sat back and told the world I was dead weight." The words hit harder than I expected, even to my own ears. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. I turned toward Robert and Susan. "Do you remember when you asked me to cover the cost of that family reunion at the lake house because you said you were short on cash? I paid for it, thousands. And not once did you thank me in front of anyone." Susan's face flushed as she twisted her napkin tighter. Then I looked at Jessica. "When your husband lost his job, who do you think paid for your kids' Christmas presents?" Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Tears pooled in her eyes, and she looked down at her lap. I finally turned back to my father. "Every month for 2 years I sent you $500. That is $12,000. I paid your bills while you told anyone who would listen that I was selfish, that I only thought of myself." The silence was suffocating. I could see Ethan's jaw tighten beside me, his hand resting near mine. His presence steadied me, but I knew these words had to come from me. Robert finally broke, his voice brittle. "Claire, maybe this isn't the place." "It is the place," I answered firmly, "because I have listened in silence too long. Tonight I am telling the truth." My father's face twisted, a storm behind his eyes. "You think this money makes you important. You think it makes you the savior of this family." I met his gaze, calm and unflinching. number. It makes me realize I was never the burden. I was the one carrying you all. The room went still again. Jessica's hands shook as she set down her fork. Susan dabbed at the corner of her eyes with her napkin. Robert stared at the table as though the wood grain could swallow him whole. Ethan spoke then, his voice quiet but clear. I have watched Claire work herself to exhaustion for years, giving and giving while being dismissed at every turn. What I saw tonight was not family. It was cruelty. My father turned toward him sharply. You don't understand our family. There's a difference between honesty and cruelty, Ethan, replied, his tone even. And tonight was cruelty. I looked around the table, my pulse steady now. I will not sit here another year and let you strip away my worth. I will not keep giving money to people who call me a burden. From this moment, things change. The air in the room seemed to shift, the current running beneath it, breaking apart. Robert opened his mouth to argue, then shut it again. Jessica finally whispered, Claire, I am sorry. Her voice trembled and her eyes glistened, but she could not look at me directly. I nodded once, acknowledging her words, though the ache inside me told me it was too little too late. My father sat rigid, his hands gripping the armrests, his face hard as stone. But I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For the first time he had no words that could bury mine. The plates of food sat cooling, the candles burned low, and no one moved to break the silence that filled every corner of the room. I folded my hands in my lap, my voice calm as I said the last words of the night. I am not your burden. I never was. The only sound that followed was the steady crackle of the fire in the hearth. My father's eyes stayed locked on me, but for the first time I saw hesitation flicker behind the hardness. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again, the lines around his face deepening. He reached for his glass, found it empty, and set it back down with a dull thud. Robert shifted in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He looked like he wanted to intervene but could not find the words. Susan smoothed the napkin in her lap until it nearly tore. Jessica pressed her palms together, whispering something under her breath that sounded like a prayer. I felt the heaviness in the room settle on my shoulders, but it was not the same as before. This weight was different. It was not theirs pressing down on me. It was my own strength anchoring me in place. Ethan's hand brushed against mine, steady and warm. He did not need to say anything. His presence told me everything I needed to know, that I was not standing alone. The children crept back into the dining room, their wide eyes darting between the adults. Jessica rose quickly, ushering them out again, her voice brittle as she promised dessert soon. Their laughter did not return this time. When she sat back down, her eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw something close to shame. Claire, she whispered, her voice cracking, I should have spoken up. I should have defended you. I studied her face, the cousin who had been the golden child for as long as I could remember. Her apology was soft, uncertain, but it was the only acknowledgement I had heard all night. I nodded once, not ready to absolve her, but willing to accept that maybe she understood now. Robert finally found his voice. Money is complicated, he began carefully, his eyes avoiding mine. Families lean on each other. I cut him off, my tone sharper than I intended. Leaning is not the same as draining. I gave until I had nothing left, and still I was called selfish. That is not family, that is exploitation. His face reddened and he looked down at his plate. Susan dabbed at her eyes, though no tears had fallen. You make it sound so harsh, she murmured. Because it is I, said firmly. My father slammed his hand against the armrest, making the dishes rattle. Enough, he barked. His voice carried the same authority it always had, but it no longer pierced me. It sounded hollow. I stood again, my chair scraping back. No, Dad. It is not enough. Not until you understand that I will not let you define me anymore. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. His chest rose and fell heavily, but he stayed silent. Ethan rose too, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. Maybe we should go, he said softly, but I shook my head. Not yet. I turned back to the table, sweeping my gaze over every face. From this moment forward, things change. I will not bankroll this family anymore. I will not be treated as less while carrying more. Jessica's eyes filled again and she whispered, Claire, please. But the plea was not enough to undo years of silence. Robert leaned back, his lips pressed into a tight line. Susan folded her napkin neatly, placing it beside her plate as if preparing to leave. Finally, my father spoke, his voice low and rough. "If you walk away from us, don't expect to come back." The words should have hurt, but instead, they steadied me. I met his gaze, calm and resolute. "I am not walking away from family, Dad. I am walking away from people who refuse to treat me like one." The candles burned lower, the wax dripping steadily down their sides. The room held its silence like a wound that would not close. I gathered my breath, feeling the fire in my chest begin to cool, not with defeat, but with clarity. I had said what I needed to say. Whether they heard it or not was no longer mine to control. I sat down again, folding my hands in my lap, my pulse finally slowing. Across from me, my father stared, but the power in his eyes was gone. The night was not over, but the battle had shifted, and for the first time I knew I had already won. The night ended quietly, without the usual laughter or warm goodbyes. One by one, they gathered their coats, avoiding my eyes as they shuffled toward the door. Robert muttered something about a long drive back to Naperville. Susan trailed behind him with her lips pressed tight, and Jessica carried her children out without looking back. Daniel left without saying a word, the faint smell of whiskey clinging to him. My father was the last to stand. He held my gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable, then turned and walked out into the cold without a word. The apartment grew still after the door closed. The fire crackled softly, the candles burned low, and I stood in the middle of the room, feeling both empty and light. Ethan wrapped his arms around me from behind, pressing his chin gently against my shoulder. "You did it," he whispered. I let out a breath I had been holding for years and nodded. For days afterward, the silence from my family was deafening. No phone calls, no texts, no emails. At first, it stung, the old wound of rejection pressing against me. But as the week went on, I realized how different this silence was. It was not the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of boundaries finally set. At work, my focus sharpened. Michael noticed and complimented me in front of the team, something he rarely did. Sarah beamed, and later told me how proud she was to see me step into my own. For the first time, I felt like I was not dragging the weight of unspoken pain into every room I entered. One Saturday afternoon in January, Jessica called. I stared at her name flashing on my phone for nearly a minute before answering. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Claire, I wanted to say I am sorry again. I should have defended you. I should have told Dad to stop." Her words tumbled out quickly, like she was afraid she might lose courage if she paused. I listened silent for a moment, then said, "Thank you. It does not erase what happened, but I appreciate it." We talked for almost an hour, the longest conversation we had ever had, without comparison hanging between us. She admitted she had spent years trying to keep Dad's approval, staying quiet to avoid his wrath. I told her I understood, but I would not accept it anymore. When we hung up, I felt a small thread of healing tug gently inside me. February brought new opportunities at work. I was assigned to lead a campaign for a major client, a project that would define my career. Long hours filled my days, but instead of exhaustion, I felt energy. I poured myself into it, sketching, designing, revising until the final product shone. When the campaign launched successfully, our client praised the team, and Michael pulled me aside. "You have a future here, Claire," he said simply. Those words stayed with me longer than he knew. Ethan celebrated with me that night, cooking dinner in my kitchen, music playing softly in the background. We sat by the window, the city lights glittering below. He raised his glass and said, "To you for proving to everyone, but especially to yourself, that you are not a burden." I laughed through tears, clinking my glass against his. Spring arrived, and with it came peace I had never known. I no longer sent money to my father or cousins. I stopped answering calls that came only when they needed something. Instead, I invested in myself. I took a trip with Ethan to the Smoky Mountains, hiked trails that left us breathless, and stood at the top of a ridge feeling the vastness of the world around me. It was there, surrounded by the quiet of the forest, that I finally understood. My worth had never belonged to my father, or Robert, or anyone else. It had always been mine. Months later, on a warm summer evening, I hosted friends for dinner. Sarah brought wine, Ethan grilled on the balcony, and laughter filled every corner of the apartment. As I looked around the table, seeing faces that celebrated me instead of tearing me down, I felt the ache of Christmas fade into something else entirely. It became a turning point the night I chose myself. My father never called to apologize. I do not know if he ever will. But I no longer wait for his words to define my peace. I built a life without his approval, and that life is more than enough. To anyone listening who has ever been told they were a burden, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not. You are more than the words of people who cannot see your worth. You deserve love, respect, and peace exactly as you are. If my story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up to family who refused to see your value? I would love to hear your experiences. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more real stories about finding strength, setting boundaries, and reclaiming your voice.